Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's webinar on how to make PCI compliance easier. We put together this webinar really based on our experience and conversations with clients. Bit of background, Cypher has been providing PCI consultancy and assessments for many, many years. And despite the experience and the skills of many clients we speak to, a lot of them still find the PCI process very complicated and difficult. So we thought, look, it'd be a really good idea to run a webinar walking companies through the PCI compliance process at a very high level, to give them an idea what is expected of them and how they can make the whole thing easier for themselves. And once again, thank you for attending today. I know you probably get 101 of these webinar invites, so if you turned up, thank you so much. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. We placed everyone on mute. Looking at the registration list, there is about 150 people registered from around the world. So obviously, to make sure everyone can watch the webinar and hear what we're saying, we placed you all on mute. There is a chat function though. We'll have time permitting, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So if you look down the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a chat button. Click that and enter any question you got, and we'll try and answer it at the end. If we don't have time to answer them, what we'll do is we'll respond to all the questions individually by email privately. You can see the screen now. Your hosts for today are Clive Bonzaya and myself. I'm the fellow on the right, and Gareth Jones. Clive is Cypher's Director of GRC. Clive has many years' experience as a PCI QSA, Qualified Security Assessor. Clive has helped lots of organisations, large and small, from SMEs to large multinational global companies through their PCI compliance assessments. And he'll be your guide today on how to make PCI compliance easier. We've got a concise agenda. What we'll do, I'll just quickly run through the 9 points. We'll start off at the top. What is PCI DSS? Now, I know some people on this call would know what it is, but for people who don't, who are just getting into it, who've just started taking credit cards and just realised that they've got to be PCI compliant. We'll run through what is PCI. We'll explain why it's important, and importantly, where do you start? Well, how do you start this whole process? We'll explain the difference between a ROC and an SAQ. A ROC is report and compliance, and SAQ means self-assessment questionnaire. It's one of these two that you'll be doing when you go through your PCI compliance, and we'll explain what the differences are. We'll explain what the PCI Assessor, the QSA, is looking for when he talks to you, when he comes to your site, and we'll explain the pitfalls and mistakes that companies make, and there are many. And we'll come through what are the key things you do to make life easier. Some of these things aren't complicated and they're quite straightforward, but the things that there are a lot of people miss. And then we'll talk about scope reduction. One of the most important parts of PCI is the beginning, actually, the scope. What are we looking at here? We'll explain why it's important and some things you can do to reduce that scope. And then we'll go through a few things of what you should be doing to get ready for an assessment when it is time for your assessment. And it's at this point, I'll hand over to my colleague, Clive, who will be your primary host for today. Clive?
Thank you, Gareth. And thank you again, everyone, for attending. So really the purpose of this, as Gareth has explained, is for us to go through this, in a methodical way and to talk about PCI DSS, generally what it is, just for those who are not in the know, and ultimately really just try and delve down a bit deeper into what that means for you as an organization, insofar as preparing and insofar as ensuring the maintenance of the various activities to ensure and maintain compliance throughout the year. And then, of course, one of the key areas of focus for us today would be many of the pitfalls that we've come across in our own experience. And a lot of this information is not just from my own point of view, it would have also been shared across our own internal QSA community. So to kick off, just at a high level, what is PCI DSS? So we know that it's mandatory, and we know that it started as part of what we call the 5-card brand scheme initiative. So effectively, Visa, American Express, JCB, Discover, MasterCard, 5 card brands in order to reduce the risk, particularly for brand damage, and ultimately in terms of the risks associated with fraud with regard to payment cards, initiated a program by which various standards were introduced in order to address these risks and ultimately to see fewer issues resulting from these risks. As part of this, the PCI SSC, or the PCI Security Standards Council, is the governing body who now looks at the maintenance cycle and the evolution of the PCI DSS, or payment card security, payment card industry security, data security standard, apologies. So effectively, how do we comply? Well, it's a reporting mechanism for demonstrating compliance. So each entity that is considered to be in scope would be an entity that processes, stores, or transmits cardholder data. And we've seen various iterations of this as the standard has progressed. It is turned into store, process, and transmit, to store, process, and transmit, and connect to, and then ultimately store, process, transmit, connect to, and have the ability to impact the security of. So we see that how the standard goes through its various evolutionary cycles. It starts to address more concerns around business as usual, third-party due diligence, third-party assurances, etc., and ultimately then resulting in what we call a ROC template, or an SAQ. And as Gareth mentioned previously, this is your report on compliance or self-assessment questionnaire. And all that is a reporting mechanism. These are defined by whichever tier you're operating at. Tiers are defined by the payment brands. So effectively, a tier 1, 2, 3, or 4 merchant will be defined by Visa as any merchant processing 6 million and above, 1 to 6 million, etc., 2, 3, and so you go on in terms of card volume. Equally with service providers, 300,000 above is considered a tier 1. Anything below 300,000 are considered a tier 2. And the key thing to point out here is that anyone at tier 1 level will always have to include a ROC and formal attestation of compliance in order to verify or validate compliance. And these are defined by Visa. However, the standards supporting these documents are maintained and evolved by the PCI Security Standards Council, not enforced. It sets the minimum baseline for what we call required technical, business, or administrative security controls. What that effectively means is it is a standard of minimum requirements. It is very black and white. Arguably, some are open to interpretation. However, the one thing that rings true, no matter which QSA you are dealing with, or however the interpretation is read from the standard, the intent of the requirement will never change. It follows the 3-year evolutionary cycle, as I've mentioned. However, it's important to note at this point that the PCI SSC, Standard Security Council, will evolve the standard on any initiative that forces such a change to become to come in place with immediate effect. So think back, if you will, when we saw the retirement of legacy TLS and the vulnerabilities associated with SSL. And as a result, pretty much immediate updates were made and entities were given a set deadline that was before the 3-year evolutionary cycle. Why is it important? Other than reducing the risk to protect against threats, what we find is it aligns perfectly with other security standards, especially ISO 27001. Why it is important is that, yes, it allows us to define, implement, and ultimately deploy all of the necessary security control requirements to secure data. However, this is payment card information. The alignment with ISO 27001 means that it can also spread across many other parts of the organization. So really, it doesn't matter what your data protection initiatives are. if PCI DSS comes into scope, it is very well a very good platform and business case in order to achieve further compliance with other objectives, such as ISO 27001 and data privacy. The completion of a ROC and an SAQ is also mandatory. So the enforcement cycle is that the card brands will enforce compliance onto acquiring banks. Acquiring banks will enforce compliance onto merchants, and merchants will enforce compliance onto their service providers. Being compliant with the PCI DSS shows that the entity takes cardholder data seriously and that they've taken the required steps to demonstrate an understanding of the importance of cardholder data. It also further assists the organization to reduce the likelihood of any business loss, brand damage, and customer reputation. Where do we start? First, the most important step is to ensure that an appropriate budget is allocated. Ensure the scope has been accurately defined, and we'll cover scoping of PCI DSS a little later on in this presentation, because arguably I would say that this is probably the most important step. Well-defined scope for PCI DSS, accurately defined and agreed with your qualified security assessor, will make for a much easier assessment and assist the organization in understanding what their obligations are in maintaining those compliance objectives. It also, considering options for descoping any of the processes and the peoples and technologies involved, whereby we are reducing our footprint for cardholder data. It helps us to identify and implement all of the required PCI DSS security requirements based on that defined scope, and then measuring applicable PCI DSS against that scope or against the in-scope environment. Remediation activities may be necessary, and typically they always are, because in many cases, we will very seldom see a first-time passing scan for vulnerability scans, or a first-time passing penetration test report for pen test results, etc. Report on compliance versus SAQ. Both mechanisms are formally used for testing compliance with PCI DSS. So we've spoken about card brands being responsible for defining the reporting requirements. What this means is, if you're a tier 1, you're doing a ROC. Tier 2, 3, 4, you're doing an SAQ. Underlying, there is no fundamental difference. They're all the same control sets that need to apply. The key differences between a ROC and an SAQ is that SAQs have been fundamentally structured to meet organizations' payment channel requirements. They have actually been formatted per payment channel. So if you're a merchant dealing with e-commerce payments only, and you've fully outsourced all of your business processes, you get to do what we call an SAQ type A. Add more processes to this, and you'll very rapidly see your SAQ requirements increase right down to what we call SAQ type D, which is effectively the same as completing a full ROC. An SAQ can be completed by a qualified internal assessor for level 2 companies or tier 2 companies, and by the organization itself, and signed by an authorized executive officer on behalf of the company for tier 3 and 4. Equally for service providers, tier 1 service providers, they will be in scope for a ROC, and a ROC must be signed and formally attested to by a QSA. So again, other than there being the differences of one being an external audit led by a QSA, which is the report of compliance and attestation of compliance, and the SAQ, which is managed internally by the organization and signed by an authorized individual of the organization. Just wanted to point out one thing, and this is a point of contention that's come up quite a few times. There's been some changes in the way that level 2 merchants have reported compliance, because initially it was a QSA-led exercise. It became an internal security assessor exercise, and an internal security assessor, or an ISA, is an individual that would have completed exactly the same course, exactly the same exam as a QSA in order to become qualified and certified by the PCI SSC. However, that would be done by a sponsoring organization. So there would still be steps that you need to go through in order to become a sponsoring organization for your ISA, and then in order for them to be able to complete what we call a Tier 2 SAQ assessment. So what is it that QSA really looks for? So effectively, initially, any exercise would start with ensuring that the scope has been accurately defined. So we talked previously about the importance of scope, and here it is. PCI DSS will apply to any people, processes, and technologies that store, process, transmit, and or connect to, or has the ability to impact the security of what we call the CDE or card data environment. So ensuring that that scope has been accurately defined in terms of technology, the people that operate those technologies, think of DBAs, think of admins, and of course the processes supporting the individuals that perform these tasks. Those are all considered to be in scope for PCI DSS. This will also include third parties with the ability to access, process, transmit, and or impact the security of cardholder data will be considered in scope also. Think of your security services providers, SIM providers, anybody who processes any kind of data as an outsourced basis, IT outsourcing, they would all be considered to be in scope for PCI DSS. The QSA will examine and observe and inspect all relevant evidence to validate that the control requirement for PCI DSS has been met. Equally with compensating controls. Compensating controls are typically used where, by way of technological restrictions or business restrictions, and even customer restrictions. And I'll give you a few examples of those. We have not been able to meet the intent of the requirement. So think back when we had to retire SSL and TLS1 legacy TLS. Most of the organizations, service providers predominantly, really struggle to get their head around the concept of, well, how do we mitigate against this when we can't use it anymore? If we turn it off, our customers can't access our services anymore. Effectively, what we used to do is inform our customers that, well, look, there is another requirement in the PCI DSS that says, you know, by a certain deadline date, and I say certain deadline date because I can't remember at the top of my head. I think it was sometime in June 2018. Service providers had to provide a secure alternative. So if you're providing a secure alternative, and ultimately coming back to PCI DSS requirements for encrypting transmissions across open public networks, wrap around what we call tunneling any legacy protocols, those were considered acceptable. This has now changed, whereby legacy TLS is now considered for POI or point of interaction devices. It means that by now, we expect service providers to have worked with their customers and equally their customers with their service providers in order to perform the remedial action to get rid of legacy TLS and SSL. And that is a key example of where we talk about compensating controls, wrapping around, tunneling around any insecure protocols. We talk about compensating controls that are above and beyond the standard. Typically speaking, an entity may be using a dated operating system. They may be using an application that hasn't had any updates. And again, this would be in support of any legacy business processes. And really, PCI DSS should not get in the way of you doing business. That is not the intent of PCI DSS. The idea with PCI DSS is to facilitate you in doing that securely. It's an enabler. So compensating controls above and beyond in instances where even applications are considered to be legacy, some operating systems are considered legacy. There are above and beyond, say, additional scanning requirements. Right now, the PCI DSS mandates quarterly scanning. Why not increase that scanning so that you are further aware of any new additional vulnerabilities that may arise? I've got entities that are scanning up to performing up to weekly scans because of the nature and the technical issues, the constraints around migrating away from what we call these legacy issues. A QSA will verify appropriate security controls Typically, this starts from the moment you set foot in the front door. This is access to the building, signing into the register, receiving your lanyard. QSAs will very keenly pay attention to whether the lanyards are indicative of being a visitor, whether staff members can be, whether they can be separated from contractors, etc. Whether that is visible. Equally with facility entry controls, things like CCTV. That is what a QSA typically would look for. It starts from the moment they set foot in the door. We'll also conduct interviews with third parties and service providers. That is with the assistance of the organization. And that would typically be where a service provider has not undertaken PCI DSS formal assessment in its own right. Many organizations nowadays have seen the value. So when I say organizations, I mean service providers have seen the value in becoming compliant in their own right. And the reason for this is because it takes them out of scope of the assessment. It means that they will not be interviewed as long as they have a valid attestation of compliance. The attestation of compliance provided by the service provider to the customer currently being assessed is what will verify the compliance status of that service provider. However, typically speaking, where that is not the case, we would conduct interviews with your third parties in order to ensure that they are meeting PCI DSS or at least operating the environment in a compliant manner. And this is key because nobody says a service provider has to be compliant unless a customer enforces that onto the service provider. Service providers typically do this because it's good for business. In some instances, they feel the need not to and are perfectly capable and able to provide the necessary evidence to show that whatever requirements they undertake, they are managing in a compliant manner. And of course, quite often we'll also look at supporting business processes and back office processes. And I say quite frequently, these are missed off because I know in the past, I'll give you another real world example. We used to do a lot of financial organizations, retailers, assessments. Well, we still do, as I say, used to. And these entities would have back office processes. Think of chargebacks. And what used to happen is, this is quite funny because a lot of merchants would be acquired by a bank and they would try their best to comply with PCI DSS because the acquiring bank says you have to comply, but then the acquiring bank will then also send them a monthly printed out email and or post hard copy that contains full PAN data for the purposes of chargebacks. Quite often, those little tiny processes were not included in the initial scope. Quite often, those processes are missed off. And quite often, you'll come into site and you'll see a big box somewhere in a corner, opening that box up, and you just find rolls and reams of hard copy cardholder data. And these are typically the things that we look for. But ultimately, what we're looking for is to work with the organization. It's not an audit. I always correct people when they say the auditor is here or here is the PCI auditor. We are PCI assessors. We work with the organization. We also help you. We also assist you in remediation activities. So in areas where some requirements can be met, however they've not been implemented at the time, we could always work with the organization and move on to another subject and come back to that again. And by the time the formal report and compliance is completed, remediation is completed. Assessors are there to help you. So typically what we're looking for first, fundamentally, is to cooperate with the organizations that are currently undergoing assessment. So mistakes that we often come across is where, and I know I've covered this, and I will cover this again and again because of the importance of this, is it incorrectly defining the scope for PCI DSS. A mission of business processes, a mission of technologies that serve under somebody's desk that has now become an entire operation supporting the business. The way that cardholder data is shared, not maintaining a register of where our data is, not understanding where we store data. These are all part and parcel of not having accurately defined the scope. Granted, a lot of initiatives have since come along. Most notably, we've seen a change in the law with the introduction of the GDPR. And with the introduction of the GDPR, I think one of the biggest exercises organizations were keen to undertake was to understand where their data is stored. We called it data mapping. Data mapping was key and integral because understanding where the data is stored means that you know what to protect or how to protect it. More importantly, how long you've had it. Yeah. So what we have is that scope can be as wide or as small as you like. If it's not accurately defined, the real risk here is losing data in an area that was not included as part of the scope for PCI DSS. Incorrectly allocating ownership. This is one of my favorites because, and when I say one of my favorites, it's because it gives me a real good opportunity to work with the organization in terms of helping to split the responsibility for PCI DSS. Yes, granted, there's a lot of technical requirements in the PCI DSS. And typically speaking, any organization either new to PCI DSS or going through the motions of PCI DSS are very keen to give it to the IT department and say, here, solve this problem. And typically, you know, that is not the sole purpose of the PCI. It is not meant to be a purely technical roadmap. PCI DSS requires a lot of additional business processes. Think particularly around requirement 12, the requirement for good governance. We talk about policy, we talk about information security, but we also talk about HR, yeah, existing staff that are in scope for PCI DSS. We talk about new starters, movers, leavers. We also talk about vetting processes as part of this. Then there are additional requirements that would apply in the perspective of third-party contracts, third-party due diligence. I think particularly around 12.8, 12.8.5 most notably, where we talk about contracts that are, and addendums to contracts that are specifically addressing the need to secure cardholder data. 12, you know, talking about matrices of responsibilities. Suddenly, we are involving a much wider part of the business. Suddenly we are focusing on a lot more processes than what is considered to be what we typically call an IT problem. Failing to maintain applicable policies and procedures. Well, this one happens very frequently. So we have a policy, great. We would review that policy. Actually, we would review that policy annually. Or even more frequently, depending on any changes. Perfect. It is the underlying procedures that oftentimes fall by the wayside. Okay. Golden rule of PCI DSS. If it's not written down, it's not happening. Yeah. If there's no document to support how it should be done, it's not happening. So if we look at the pyramid for documentation, policies being at the top, standard supporting policies, procedures supporting standards. These are all documents that are integral and core to a PCI DSS assessment. The typical assessment will have up to 1,400 document types required for that assessment to become a success. We're not just talking about policy. Sending me a list of 17 policies and saying that we address all of our requirements in this way is not validation that we are following those procedures internally. Sending me the standard tells me what we're supposed to be doing. Sending me the process and ultimately interviewing a subject matter expert is what completes this circle. Typically, you would very often come across a supporting process that has been documented in 2014, has never been reviewed because there hasn't been any need to review the process, with a policy ultimately above the standard that has been reviewed last year. Typically speaking, that would mean that, in effect, for that particular process, that would be a non-compliance in terms of documentation. Yeah? There is no evidence to suggest that we are still working in the correct manner since this was last looked at in 2014. A lot of organizations will make the assumption that PCI DSS or certain PCI DSS requirements do not apply to them. I think from a broad spectrum perspective, PCI, the PCI SSC has tried to address this issue by including the third-party responsibility matrix. Great, that will address what we call third-party due diligence and third-party matrix of responsibilities, i.e. we know who does what. When it comes to internal management of PCI DSS, it's really the internal processes that are considered to be not in scope purely because they have misunderstood the standard and or requirements and sub-requirements within the standard, and therefore just assume that that did not apply to them. One very good example of where I came across this particular instance is where a tokenization solution was implemented. However, the tokenization solution was not implemented in the manner as defined by the tokenization guidelines that was released by the PCI SSE and or acceptable in accordance with what we consider acceptable or in place for PCI DSS. And in effect, the entire tokenization solution became null and void. And this was purely because only 2 digits in the middle of the range was left out, or masked even. So you can see how that was considered to be out of scope, because now we've got tokenization. Another example of where data is considered out of scope is when it's encrypted. You see, most entities will encrypt data and think, well, okay, it's out of scope. However, we've got to think of the keys. Who has the keys to decrypt the data? Okay, once we start putting these bits and pieces together, quite frequently we'll come across, well, actually, no, it's not out of scope. It is still considered to be in scope. Yes, we can reduce the scope using encryption, and I'll cover that later on in the slide pack, but it does not mean it's out of scope. And that is frequently one of the most occurring issues, is coming across a process, a way of handling data, and or a control that was implemented, and by way of doing this, assuming that they've taken it out of scope for PCI. Many organizations will spend disproportionate amounts of money on tools. And when I talk about disproportionate amounts, I'm talking to your small, medium enterprises that are buying the most expensive GRC tools, the most expensive scanning tools, as opposed to opting for a more basic subscription type, something that can be tailored, something that's more suitable to your environment, and or even outsourcing that particular obligation. And when we talk about this, it's really in terms of tools, they come at a cost. They come at implementation a cost and consultancy. They ultimately, they have to be managed correctly nonetheless. And again, another key example of this is where a very immature organization has gone ahead and purchased Tripwire. Tripwire being, a good tool. And again, we're not doing everything tool-based, and we're not going to poo any tools or the use of tools. The key thing to remember here is the organization wasn't mature enough to handle such a tool. Ultimately, spending so much money on implementing it, so much money on getting a consultant to come in and assist them in fine-tuning it, only for that consultant to leave and then sit with the resulting output, which was so much noise, they weren't able to manage the noise. So spending disproportionate amounts of money on tools to try and meet a requirement, and yet ineffectively by way of ineffective management of that tool, still not meeting PCI DSS is another frequent issue I come across. Periodic activities will include things such as data reviews, data retention reviews for cardholder data, which specifies every quarter we need to look at the data that we retain, and we need to determine whether we still need that data. And we do this by having a data retention standard or data retention schedule. And for that, we have a business reason or a business purpose. I've seen many retention schedules. I've seen them for up to 1 year, 6, 7 years, or 6+1. And I've even seen data retention schedules that require indefinite retention. And the reason they verified the business justification of indefinite retention is because they're an issuer. As part of being an issuer, they need to hold on to pen block data, they need to hold on to mag strip data, they need to hold on to the PAN data as long as time goes back since the issuing of that card. That is considered appropriate for issuing services as long as you wrap the appropriate controls around that particular service. However, for most merchants and service providers, it is the failure to schedule periodic activities such as penetration testing. Yeah, so penetration testing, annually external. If you're a service provider, internally biannual. Okay, vulnerability scans, quarterly. ASV scans, quarterly. Just for everyone on the call, if you're not familiar with ASV, that is approved scanning vendor, and that's effectively a third-party entity that is qualified as an ASV company, operate as an ASV company, has ASV employees certified by the PCI DSS Council who have the capability and more importantly, the knowledge for performing your external scans, typically against any kind of applications that will process, transmit cardholder data. But it's a failure in ensuring that these periodic activities are scheduled in time that I see, I think 9 out of 10 assessments, that is the case. That you would get on site and somebody has said to me, oh, we haven't scheduled that, but we've made the appointment, it's due next week. I hear that one most often. Or here's another one. Yeah, here are our quarterly scans. They run from January, February, March, and April. Right, okay, you've given me 4 scans. Those are not quarterly scans. Quarterly scans does not mean give me 4. It means give me 4 across the span of an annual working year. Equally for segmentation, requirements have come in for segmentation testing where entities are using segmentation in order to have that tested by a penetration tester. That needs to be completed in a timely manner also. Any kind of incident response, I think for the most part is taken seriously by the organizations, all of the organizations that I've dealt with. Yes, they do. What I do frequently come across and have in the past, and I'm not talking about Cypher customers, I'm talking about customers that I worked with at the various QSA companies that I've been at, it's all been more or less the same, is that the incident response plan is absolutely fine-tuned, lists all of the roles and responsibilities, is second to none, but it's not tested. More importantly, quite frequently, it doesn't include cyber incidents. Usually these are incidents related, what we call a P1 or priority 1 issue, that's related to technologies. Yeah, so we get it. We have a service. That service requires underpinning components to operate correctly. And ultimately, we've defined an SLA or uptime around those components, which is then linked to revenue. We get it. If one of those components go down, it becomes a priority 1. What is the priority for a data leak? What is the priority for a card data leak? Who do we contact in the event of a card breach? And this is where it becomes tricky because most organizations are incapable of providing you with a formulated plan that makes allowance for payment card information, or at least information, and then subcategorizing PCI data as part of that information. Also, making allowance for testing that particular plan, at least annually, to ensure that the plan is still robust, that ownership is still fine, and that where issues have been detected in the management of the incident, whether it be a desktop exercise, or whether we have an enacted exercise, like a scenario training exercise, you know, it gives us the opportunity to evolve our incident response plan to make it better. So without the regular testing, well, those things aren't happening. We are not evolving the plan. We're not ensuring the plan works when we need it. And then, of course, outsourcing activities to service providers without proper due diligence. Okay, so I think most organizations now, especially since so many laws around data privacy have changed, and I think that most organizations have matured, and all organizations, all that I've worked with in the past, have demonstrated that they perform due diligence against their third parties. When we talk about necessary due diligence, we talk specifically around data retention, classifying data, and ultimately enforcing that onto the service provider, and then also where service providers are not PCI DSS compliant in their own right, not ensuring that those service providers are actually aware of what they should be managing or how they should be managing it. So that relationship is not being managed from the offset because nobody performed the due diligence to see what will we share with this organization, what is required for us to share that securely, and ultimately, what happens when we no longer share data with this organization? How is that data deleted? How do we get rid of it? So most things that we advise our customers in terms of what makes their life easier, it's effectively to manage PCI DSS as business as usual. Incorporate it into your business as usual practices. It means that by working in a PCI DSS compliant manner, adopting the PCI DSS mindset, think about things like application development. PCI DSS will say, test the code. PCI DSS will say, address vulnerabilities. If we incorporate that as part of our software development lifecycle, we're managing those requirements as BAU. There are many examples where managing these obligations as business as usual has actually taken care of a lot of the headaches that most companies endure when it comes down after having scheduled a PCI assessment, when it comes down to the crunch and that evidence is simply not available. Ensuring that a reasonable budget is allocated. And when I say budget, I don't mean pay your QSA company. That's nice, but I'm talking about a budget internally. Ensuring that individuals, resources, the tools, the documents, the staff members, everybody, it is a people process. It is a people thing. Yeah, much like all cybersecurity or information security initiatives, it's about people. People can be the strongest or weakest link. Typically speaking, having your subject matter experts well trained, your developers undergo their annual training in secure coding standards, having appropriate members of staff, relevant members of staff associated with the relevant controls that they need to undertake, assigning ownership, and ultimately resource when it comes down to performing these assessments. That all falls part and parcel of having a reasonable budget. It does not mean obtain a budget and go buy expensive tools. It means have a budget available that is appropriate for your environment, that is appropriate to help undertake an assessment with relatively pain-free issues or any events, and ultimately to make sure that we're operating continuously on a PCI DSS manner, much as what I alluded to in the first point, business as usual. Maintaining vulnerability and patch management schedules, these are critical. PCI DSS is very, very specific about when we scan, what we scan, when to patch. Critical patches, they define that. We use a scoring system, CVSS. Everything is ranked. One of the things I do want to point out here, and I know this comes back to some of the issues from the previous slide, just come to my attention when I look at vulnerability and patch management, is that a lot of entities make the mistake that a penetration test, a failing penetration test, can be risk assessed. It's not the case. Vulnerability and patch management is what we risk assess, okay? Because a vulnerability may exist. However, after a risk assessment, that vulnerability may be deemed to be low likelihood of occurrence, which means that the impact may be high, but with a very low probability of occurrence. You effectively reduce the risk against that vulnerability. You can risk assess, accept, and manage vulnerabilities internal where you are unable to deploy them. Critical patches, however, critical vendor patches must be deployed within 30 days of release. And the reason for that is because they are deemed to be critical. And again, once the entity receives what is called a critical patch, if it does not apply to them, or the sheer total of controls around this vulnerability has reduced that risk to a negligible risk, we can again say this actually becomes acceptable. Where it's unacceptable is a penetration test report, because a penetration tester will mimic the attack behavior, the attack vector of a malicious individual. And if they can find something exploitable, and it is noted exploitable, which means that the software, the tools, the knowledge of how to exploit this particular vulnerability is freely available, even YouTube videos about it, we are talking noted exploitable. We are saying that this must be addressed. There's no risk assessment where that is concerned. Coming back to my point about maintaining vulnerability and patch management, have a schedule. Make sure that these are done on time. Make sure that we are aware of new patches as and when they are released. Yeah, ensuring that those patches are tested and deployed in a timely manner. Maintaining that means that by the time the assessment comes along, the chances of your QSA finding vulnerable or untested technologies reduces. The likelihood of that reduces significantly. Assigning ownership to relevant internal stakeholders means that everyone gets a share of the pie. It means that where we are assigning business, or what we call administrative controls, technical controls, we are sharing these control sets to the relevant internal stakeholders. It becomes much less arduous to manage an entire PCI DSS compliance strategy when the requirements are shared out amongst the appropriate stakeholders within the relevant areas. Most entities will have a network team, an IT team, an admin team, a DBA team, you name it. Sharing these responsibilities out and teaching them and educating them about what their responsibilities are in meeting these requirements is what I found has been one of the most effective ways of managing this. In one particular organization where we've seen very, very good behavior, excellent transformation, is where the organization has actually enlisted the assistance of Cypher to come in and actually do quarterly reviews for them. And on a quarterly basis, we would go into this organization and we would actually look at each of the business processes individually, targeting a certain subset and samples on a quarterly cycle, just to do that additional layer of sanity check to make sure that when the time comes and they have to go through formal assessment, there are no showstoppers and no surprises. And this kind of links very well into performing periodic internal status review. Make a part of your internal review or internal compliance program. Again, by having assigned ownership to these relevant stakeholders and then performing these periodical internal status reviews against the relevant areas and departments and from those stakeholders, that keeps you, again, one step ahead of where you need to be. And it keeps a view of compliance throughout the year. This makes managing PCI DSS as a BAU effective and in place, and it ensures that ultimately the cost of remediation is quite often foregoed or not an issue for most organizations. When we talk about timely manner scheduling, again, one of the more important things here is your penetration tests. Penetration tests, once you've had a test and that test is a fail, please remember that we need to allow time to reschedule. Not only reschedule, remediate. Not only remediate, we have the lead time of the company that we've worked with. I've seen gaps for about as long as a month go between remediation and retesting purely because of availability. Okay, so it's the key thing here is the sooner we do these things well in advance and or in preparation of our formal assessment, the more time we are cutting ourselves to remediate issues and retest. Because once again, that is a requirement. If you failed a penetration test and you have remediated, a retest is mandatory. So how do we reduce the scope for PCI DSS? So I like touch on segmentation. Segmentation is effectively implemented by way of firewall, where we restrict transmissions of data between what we call the non-CDE or insecure network and the CDE. Isolating this network from other networks means that we are reducing the scope to the components within that particular network. Equally, layer 3 switches with strong access control lists are considered acceptable measures for segmentation. So effectively outsourcing any business process that we don't want to remediate internally and or which may or may not carry a budget or resource constraint. Outsourcing is a very effective way of reducing the scope of PCI DSS because you're outsourcing not only part of your scope, you're also outsourcing your risk in so far as where service providers have in their own right undergone a PCI DSS formal assessment. What does this mean? An attestation of compliance for a third party or a merchant or a service provider, anybody who holds an attestation of compliance is attesting to being compliant with PCI DSS. Once that attestation compliance has been issued by a QSA, there is a manner of liability that's signed off with that. Okay, so it means that in the event of a data breach, and we've seen this in the past, where QSA companies have suffered lawsuits or liability lawsuits as a result of major data breaches, equally with an SAQ where an entity internally signs it off and accepts the risk. Outsourcing very much in the same way to a PCI DSS compliant service provider means that we are reducing our scope. We're taking card holder data out of scope. We're giving it to a compliant third party. And if a QSA has signed off in attestation that they're compliant, we've also offset some part of the risk. The same with an AOC that is attached to an SAQ. The documents are integral. It means an SAQ will have embedded within it an attestation of compliance that is signed by the duly authorized individual within the organization. And in doing so, again, that statement is, yes, we are compliant. All of the statements are true and correct. We accept the responsibility and liability as a result of signing this AOC. So you can see how outsourcing not only takes data out of scope, but can actually help you to offset some of your risk as well. Secure deletion. So when we reviewed this slide back before the webinar, we had the word deletion or data deletion. And we had it amended to secure deletion, or we changed it to secure deletion, because here's the thing, just getting rid or deleting data is not in its own right PCI DSS compliant, because the rationale is that with the correct tools and technologies, the data can be reconstituted and or made readable. The PCI DSS makes specific requirements for secure deletion mechanisms. And what this means is that we need to at least implement a way or means, whether it be physical destruction, such as shredding and degaussing, in order to make sure that the data can never be recovered once it's been deleted. And this is one of the key points of focus for most QSAs when looking at third-party data retention, is what their secure deletion mechanism looks like. Because once your customer says to a third party, we no longer need that data, it needs to be deleted, we cannot simply wipe the data or delete the data. It needs to be secure. Secure wipe, secure destruction, secure disposal. And then of course, encryption. And what we mean by encryption is particularly, without stating the obvious, of course, point-to-point encryption. And this is where data is encrypted at one point, travels through an entire infrastructure of systems as unreadable data, and is then decrypted in a completely different environment. What we've done is we've taken those systems out of scope. Think particularly where we talk about P2PE or point-to-point encryption in the retail environment. Most merchants who are operating face-to-face payment channels nowadays will opt for what we call a P2PE solution. These are all, by the way, listed on the council's website. So if you do look for a P2PE provider, you can search for them on the PCI Council website. But ultimately, what the solution aims to provide is that at the point of interaction, cardholder data is encrypted. The entity that's processing the transaction does not have access to the decryption keys. If the cardholder data is encrypted and you do not have access to the keys, you cannot decrypt it. Meaning that whoever the entity is where that finally comes to rest, where that is decrypted, well, they'll need to be compliant in their own right, and usually they are, because that is a component that fits in with the entire P2PE solution. But the point I'm trying to make is, by way of encryption, we have taken away the shop router or switch or firewall network, point of sale, back office systems, back office servers, stock server, reconciliation, financial reports, stock reports, anything that could potentially hold, think about receipts, the most obvious one I mentioned by way of last mention, not containing cardholder data, all taken out of scope by way of encryption. I just got to point out at this point, encrypted cardholder data at rest internally with an organization does not render the cardholder data out of scope. That is not a manner of scope reduction. However, if you were to encrypt data and you were not to access that data again, and you were to give the keys to a third party, say in escrow, and you did not have copies of the keys and you were able to verify that, that could be considered out of scope because there's no way to decrypt it. You see where these little nuances come in. And the whole point I'm trying to make is that once something is encrypted, the only way to ensure that it is a scope reduction activity is to ensure that we know where the keys are. We know that when we are transporting that data in an encrypted state, that we do not have the ability to encrypt that data because it will not take it out of scope to decrypt it even. So what do we do to get ready for an assessment? Again, timely scheduling, ensuring that all parties, all stakeholders have been appropriately informed, briefing stakeholders. So quite often, you know, you'll start an assessment and we'll be presented with a relevant stakeholder for that particular area or the representative subject matter expert. And again, I'll have to use one of my most recent examples where I did an assessment and part of this assessment included an application development team and they were in-house. And when I interviewed the application developer and said, right, okay, show me where your software development life cycle is. I mean, you know, where is it saved? Where is it stored? Is it on a wiki, an intranet somewhere? And the best part of 25 minutes went by until the InfoSec manager had to intervene and say, okay, look, here's the document. We actually store it on this part of the network. Well, you know, again, yes, they have an SDLC. That's a check in a box. Yes, they have a developer that has been trained in secure coding practices. That is a check in a box. But that developer has no idea where the process is and or where the policy is. And that was very clear just from that one interview that quite clearly overran by 20 minutes. So briefing your stakeholders before an assessor comes on site is a very good way of preparing for an assessment, ensuring that they know what they'll be asked. Also, I would like to add here, ensuring that they can know that they can challenge their QSA. This is fundamental. We urge all of our customers to challenge our QSA community at all times. And the reason for this is because when a QSA comes on site, and I'll try and use kind of a synonymous wording here or and kind of give a sort of lay-term example. When we are saying to somebody we're going to talk about the table, it doesn't mean we're going to talk about the dining room chair, okay? So effectively, once that scope creep starts to come in and an assessor tries to obtain information that was not relevant or briefed to that particular internal stakeholder, they're more than welcome to put their hand up and say, actually, you know, I can't comment on that, or why is this necessary? Challenge your QSA. But equally, put the responsibility on your QSA to give you an audit agenda, yeah? So that you know what to prepare for. You know what you can brief your stakeholders on, what they need to have ready when that assessor comes on site. And then, of course, allocating sufficient time and resource. By that, we mean, you know, where holidays, you know, or we all have holiday season. I know in the UK, you know, July, August, very popular holiday season. Effectively, what this means is that quite often you get on site and the individual who's actually the SME is not available. You know, try and schedule those reviews beforehand, or try and schedule your assessment prior to all of this happening. And or, again, when it comes to briefing stakeholders or replacement stakeholders, at least try and ensure that that individual who attends the meeting, whilst the subject matter originally planned was on holiday, you know, that they know where to find stuff, that they know how to answer the questions, and that they know what we're looking for. There should be no surprises in a formal assessment. Okay, a QSA is not there to catch you out. Okay, that is typically behaviors that we would encourage all organizations to report and or to include as part of their feedback to the PCI SSC. Because one of the things that I just want to kind of sign off with on this particular subject matter is that before starting an assessment and what to prepare for is also to make sure that your QSA gives you all of the relevant links to providing feedback. QSA feedback is encouraged, it's mandatory, it's requested by the PCI SSC, okay, so that they can keep track of the performance of their QSAs. So it's a two-way street. And in order to get to this, to the end result, a successful end result, we always encourage timely scheduling, a good briefing of stakeholders, a good two-way conversation with your QSA, and ultimately ensuring that the correct resources and sufficient time has been allocated. Thank you very much. That was me jabbering on for a while there. If there's any questions?
We do actually. Hi, it's Gareth again. We've got a question from Clayton actually in the question panel. What Clayton's asked is, how would we look at the risk assessments around PCI DSS as a process? How often should it happen? And generally, who should initiate it?
Okay, so that's a two-part question. Let me answer the first part first. So in terms of risk assessments, if you look at the PCI DSS standard strictly, is at least annually. Perform risk assessments at least annually, or after every significant change. I think it comes down to the organization and how mature they are in terms of risk management. Okay, so there's lots of guidance around how to manage risk out there. The GDPR incorporates risk, ISO 27001 incorporates risk, PCI DSS incorporates risk, and they try and put a period of time behind it. The point is that if you look at it truly from an organizational perspective, some organizations, depending on what the risk is, will actually need to review that a lot sooner than a year, because the risk, so when we say risk, we talk about likelihood and impact. Yeah, that could be a lot higher than what the organization is willing to tolerate for extended periods of time. So if we're talking strictly PCI DSS, at least annually or after any changes in the threat landscape. If we talk about you as a business personally, when we do consulting, it comes down to you as an organization. How comfortable are you that your risks has reached the highest level within the organization? So do we see board level or executive level engagement when it comes to risk? Are senior management involved? Does the organization know? Has the risk been reported adequately, and how is the risk being managed? Based on those factors, that should really determine how often or infrequent you would perform a risk assessment. Yeah, but from a PCI perspective, at least annually, or after if there's any significant change in the threat landscape or in the risk itself that you have as an organization. And then in terms of who initiates that, everyone within an organization should highlight an issue or a risk. Now, let's not confuse the two. We did a little webinar a while ago. Actually, it was what was it called? What's that thing called? Remind me again, Gareth. The chat we did a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, a podcast. It was we did a podcast a while ago where we talked about risk and issues. An issue is something that has happened. Okay, so and I can tell you this, if I say it this way, you'll know. A risk is something you can smell, and an issue, you're standing in it. It's too late. Don't confuse risk and issues. So when we talk about who should initiate risk, that's everybody. Everybody has a responsibility to highlight any scenarios that could present a risk. In terms of initiating risk assessments and starting a risk assessment exercise, typically this is usually assigned to a security department or an individual within the security and or compliance department who would look at risks from a technology perspective. Business risk will typically sit at business level. So we talk about corporate risk because there will be a defined appetite, usually much higher than what we're willing to accept, and usually communicated at an executive level. But from an information security and data security and technological perspective, typically speaking, this sits within information security in collaboration with IT and networks, etc. And the way to get your risks featured at board level is to find a vehicle. Find a vehicle that gets your risks raised at the correct level. And by vehicle, we mean try to find a way in which to present your risk in such a manner that it is not about a port SQL open on, sniff opening 4. I'm sorry, those are all technical terms nobody cares about, including myself. A real risk is where we have an identified threat, an identified vulnerability, it sits within our organization. Based on our exposure, that risk becomes a very, very likely event to happen. And how would that impact our objectives as an organization? What are our objectives? Yeah, map those and find your vehicle to get risk to the appropriate level.
Thank you. Clive, we have another question from Brandon on the panel. How do you deal with coming after another QSA company that's scoped an application as out of scope? You know, the previous QSA company said it's out of scope, like something like a payment terminal that doesn't qualify as a bespoke application and is also not PCI DSS certified.
Right. Okay. So what we talk about is an application that should have been PCI DSS certified because it's not bespoke. So we're talking about COTS, commercial off-the-shelf software, and the QSA has previously said that the application is out of scope. Well, here's the thing. The QSA community, we don't go after each other. We work with our customers. So typically speaking, a customer would have received guidance from a QSA based on the evidence and facts that were presented at the time. Another QSA may arguably find that that is actually not correct and will advise the customer accordingly. And that's all we can do. Yeah, we can advise the customer that the reasons being for it being incorrect is A, B, and C. What I would advise though is that when we do give advice, okay, I always say to customers, do not take advice over a telephone call. Do not take advice over an email unless it's formal. Okay, sorry, I mean text message. Unless it's formal, like in an email, get it in writing. Once you have that in writing and you have that formalized, any objectives that you can make, I mean, as an organization, you are free to raise any complaints about a QSA, if you have any, to the PCI SSC via the feedback process. And I can guarantee you those are typically looked into. But one QSA will never contest another QSA. What I would do in that situation is review what the customers presented to me, explain what my thinking is behind this to open up a two-way conversation. I will then hear the customer has given me these reasons as to why they were told it's out of scope. And I would then go away and find the necessary evidence to support in writing from the PCI SSC, because look, we've got a list of FAQs, guys. We've got a list of documents. It's all on the PCI Council's website, freely available for download. Yeah. So if there's anything unclear about any of the advice that you've given, have a look at things like the standards. There's always qualifying criteria in the standards. There's always a checkbox, something that can be ticked. Look at SAQs. In that example, there's a before you begin section. What I'm saying is that I would provide to the customer my particular point of view based on factual evidence in writing that will substantiate that. Okay, but at no point do we as the QSA community challenge or go after each other, if that makes sense. However, it's in saying that we're also open to having a two-way conversation with the organization's QSA and ask them to verify, or at least provide some justification as to what the thinking is behind the fact that they said that it's not in scope for PCI DSS. Because sometimes there could be underlying contributing factors that may not have been explained to me, if that makes sense. So really, in answer to that question is, we address that through communication, openness to communicate with our fellow QSAs, and ultimately by providing the facts to support any of the statements that we have.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think that's it for today. We've run a few minutes over time. What we'll be doing, we're recording this webinar, and what we'll do is you'll get an email shortly within the next 24 hours of a link to the recording of it. So if if people only came in late or they jumped out before the end because of time, they can always watch it back. So I'd like to thank you finally for being on this webinar and taking the time out of your busy day to be on the webinar. If you do have any questions, you can see an email on the bottom of the screen here, marketing@cypher.com. Shoot us an email. I mean, just we're not just talking specifically sales type of things. Even if you just have a query, or there's a few things that have come up from listening to this webinar today, you know, it may just jump in your mind afterwards when you're making yourself a cup of coffee in the kitchen, and then say, oh, right, I've just thought of this question. Just shoot it to us. We just want to engage with people. That's the most important thing, is just to drive engagement and see where we can take it from there. Thank you very, very much.
Gareth, can I, sorry, just in one closing thing, can I just add to Brandon, who asked that question, if the application does not qualify as a bespoke application, is not PCI DSS certified, and does not have to be PCI DSS certified. In other words, it does not perform what we call authorization and settlement, because that's another requirement. If all of those requirements are met, and your application is truly not in scope for PCI DSS, yes, we would certify them, despite what another QSA has said. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Clive, and thank you all for coming today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.